this is the left moccasin for a pair I made for my granddaughter not too long ago, and her foot is growing, so I'm going to make her a new pair. And she has told me that she wants a pair with fringe, which of course will look very much like a Native American moccasin, but at the end of this video I'll show you how many variations, how many different ways you can make the top line to make these shoes look much more contemporary, if that's what you'd like. So I drew this outline of her foot with her standing on this folder and held the pencil straight up and down. I held the pencil straight up and down except for around the heel. So around the heel I slanted my pencil so I could reach in as far as I could to exactly mark where the heel of the foot touches the surface underneath. I've done quite a lot with this pattern. I took her sole pattern and drew around it on another piece of file folder, and I smoothed out the area around her toes because of course you don't want those bumps. Then I drew a line where it seems like the widest part of her foot is across the ball of the foot, and I measured around her foot. I used a tape measure here, but you can take a string and bring it around her foot and then lay that next to a ruler. I got that across her sole it's 3 inches, and around her foot it's 8 inches at that point. So then I drew that line, and to draw that line I drew a line that seemed to be down the middle of the sole. It's a little hard because the sole is so irregularly shaped, but I think that's about it. And then I drew another line perpendicular to that line right at the bottom of the pattern, right at the bottom of the sole. And I drew the halfway line, which you can just measure and get that, or fold your pattern into and get it. Then I also added this line and this line, the outside of the foot and the inside of the foot. From the widest part of the foot I drew straight down to that horizontal line, and also on the inside of the foot. Here you see that I've taken this pattern and made a much bigger pattern. So this is a side seam pattern. Right here is the seam that you don't stitch, and out here is the seam that you do stitch. So let's figure this out. What I did first was draw a line vertically on the file folder, and 1.5 inches or so from the bottom edge I drew a line perpendicular to that line. This gave me a little niche that I can copy this pattern in. And it's important that I remember about the widest part of the foot line. But there is some math that needs to be done. So this is 3 inches across, and when I flip this pattern over, this is 3 inches across. But her foot is 8 inches around, so that means I need to add sides to this moccasin. If I've got 3 inches across the sole here and the same here, and it's 8 inches around, this is really easy. I just add 1 inch. So I drew that center line and the base line, and then I measured over 1 inch and added the inch to the inside of the moccasin. And I need to do the same thing all around it. So when I drew that line 1 inch over, then I flipped this over and put it in place right between the vertical and horizontal lines. So now what's left to do is to add an inch around the rest of this underfoot part where all the gathering is going to take place, because it's going to be so much bigger than the one over the top of the foot. So I added an inch down here below that vertical line, and then I use my compass to go around here with 1 inch and meet up with this line. To finish the pattern, there's 2 more areas to work with. One is the top line. So this is my halfway line, and I'm making a T opening on this moccasin. So I found the halfway line, the center of the halfway line, and drew a line down to the bottom of the pattern. And then I thought a 3/4 inch would be good on each side for opening. So I made those marks so that the pattern then will have this T shape. So I've cut it out, and now have used the compass set at 3/16 of an inch, which is the distance that I like stitch holes to be from the edge. And so from this widest part of the foot line, I drew around here, on down here, to that widest part on the other side, and did the same on the overfoot part of the moccasin. All the way, now on this side I went all the way down to the very end. Now the stitch marks for right now are just going to go on the overfoot part, and they're going to be 1/4 of an inch apart. I think that's a good distance, so that the gathers are not too small or too big. So I'm marking off 1/4 of an inch, and I will continue with that in the tape measure all the way around this edge until I get down to this point. I have punched holes out around the toe area and down this side of the overfoot part. I used this 00 hand punch, which you can get from most leather stores, and I always put this a piece of some similar material under where I'm punching, so that the punch goes all the way through the piece that's on the top. You can also use a 00 drive punch, which you would need something to put under. Here's a chunk of log that I like to use, and then you would need a mallet or hammer or something to hit this drive punch with. So then I've got these holes made, and I needed to transfer those holes over here so they'd be the same. So to do that, I just made a little pattern that I copied the stitch holes and then flipped it over and put it over here and drew the new stitch marks. So now, to finish this pattern, I need to put stitch marks around the edge of this section. To place the stitch marks for the underfoot part, so I put a few in place so you could see them well. What I'm doing is I have copied what the stitch holes here, I've copied them here, and now I'm just making radiating lines all around. So here I have 2 points, and I'm going to eyeball what I think is the point in between, and then I'll get a sense of how everything looks. So I did this one radiating, then I could find this halfway point here for that one and that one. So I'll finish doing this, and then I'll look at them and see if everything looks like it's spaced as best as possible. Here's the completed moccashoe pattern. You'll notice that I've added stitch marks for the heel seam, and I'm going to describe that to you in just a minute. First, I want to emphasize that when you make the top line, whether it's this line down the center or maybe something that comes to a V or rounded, that you want to make sure that both sides are equidistant. So for the center one here, it's this distance should be exactly equal to that distance, or your heel seam won't be even. And now to the back of the heel. So to make this, first you had this line already drawn that was at the base of the sole pattern. So I took a strip of paper and cut it to the distance between these two lines on the bottom sole, and then I folded it into quarters, and each of these sections showed me where to draw a line. So I drew from this one, I drew a line here, I drew a line here, and then I drew a little dash line in the center there. I also used this strip, 1/4 of it, to give me the distance here. So I drew this other line down here, using this as my measuring tool. The center part here is that rectangle that folds up. And on the sides, you have the holes that match with these when you're ready to stitch it. So they come up kind of like that on both sides. So to mark the stitch holes, I want an equal number on each side of that center line. So since this is a child's moccashoe, I want, in general, my stitches to be about 1/4 of an inch apart. I put 3 stitch holes here and 3 here, and then 3 on each side. So that means I need to have these areas matching. So I wrote the word side and top because it's kind of confusing, and I duplicated what was on the side here and what was on the top here, although of course they're the same. So just make sure that you get these in the right place on this edge and that edge, and the same over here. So when you have that all in place, the only thing left to do is punch stitch holes for the heel seam. And you'll notice that here, above this area, I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 stitch holes. And here I have 6. And fortunately, over here, I have the other 4. So when this all gets stitched together, it should work out just fine. Using this pattern, I have cut out my felt mock-up. So I have stitch marks all around the edges. I have the top line cut, and I've got my little rectangle cut with the stitch marks on it, and then these side pieces. So I'm going to start with stitching the toe area. I'm starting my stitching here on the bottom of the moccashoe, and I've tied a knot at the end, and I'm just going to go from side to side through these stitch marks, and before long I'll start getting some gathers on the bottom sole part. And of course that's what you expect from a moccasin. So I'm going to give it a little tug every once in a while. You can see that these holes being further apart are going to create those gathers. And so I kind of pull them out with my needle so they all look the same. So I'm going to go on around here until I reach this point, stitching the side. So I've been stitching the side seam since this is the end of the toe seam area, and you can fold this over and stitch. In fact, on a mock-up you don't really need to have all the stitch marks marked. Just line it up and stitch away, but loose so that this edge can stand up when you're finished. So thinking ahead, we're going to finish stitching this side seam and then stitch the heel seam, and then try on this mock-up to see how it fits. If it's too long or too short, we'll need to make a change in the mock-up. And what I'm suggesting that you do is to cut across somewhere right in this area and either add in a little extra space if that's what you need, or remove some of the felt if it's too long. And then you would use duct tape, and I'll show you how to do that, to make that adjustment. But it's really helpful if you stop stitching and cut off your thread and leave a little gap so that if you need to cut it, you don't have to deal with those ends of the thread unraveling. So I just cut that thread, and then I'm going to start up again a couple of stitch marks over and complete stitching this side seam. I've started stitching the heel seam. Here I've finished the side seam and left that little gap there in case I need to make some adjustment. So I'm just going across from one stitch mark pair to the next. So that means I am making a diagonal stitch. And then I'm also just going straight across, or else with just diagonal stitches, it starts to really make the seam kind of askew. So just a diagonal and then straight across. So I'll continue that down to this point here at the base of the heel seam. The heel seam is complete. Make sure that you don't pull these stitches too tight so that these two pieces of felt butt up next to each other, not that they're stitched tightly. That's the full size that it should be. And so to stitch this little rectangle, I made a knot and on the inside here and pulled it through here. Going to go in and out. Just a simple running stitch around these three sides of the rectangle, and the mock-up will be done and we can try it on. And here's the mock-up on my granddaughter's foot. As you can see, there's a little bit of room in the back of the heel. So I'm going to shorten it a bit. If this mock-up had been a little short, I would have cut it in that area where I didn't stitch and added a strip of duct tape. So you can see the duct tape, I laid the duct tape down, then put one edge along it, and then realizing the distance that I wanted, about a ½ inch between the two, I laid the other one down to match, and then would try the mock-up on again to see if that was the perfect fit. However, the situation was that this shoe was about 1/2 inch too long for my granddaughter, so I cut it along a line in the area where I didn't stitch in the side seam and removed a strip 1/2 inch wide, then whip stitched the moccashoe back together. Tried it on her, and this time it was a good fit. If you plan to put a cord around the top line of this moccasin, you want to have the correct number of holes along the side for the cord to go through. I had originally done 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 holes, and that results in the cord at the back of the heel being inside the moccasin, and of course nobody's going to like to have that rubbing against their heel. One here, just make one lined up there, one near the back of the heel, another one not far from that first one, and then divide the rest of the space into thirds. And that will give you 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 holes. And that means that this part will go outside of the moccasin and we'll just draw it in so it feels nice and secure at the heel. Another thing is that sometimes moccasins are a little baggy along the sides, so you can if you notice that your mock-up is kind of baggy, you can cut out a piece from the bottom. So I'm going to cut out along that line. It's the center of this curve is a little below the halfway mark of the moccasin, and comes to a point at both ends, and then just whip stitch this together. So when you're making the actual shoe, you would do this before you put any soling on. Do the soling the same way that you would ordinarily, so this doesn't affect that. I cut it out and then we'll stitch it closed. The mock-up is finished, so I can try this on my granddaughter and see if any alterations need to be made. Maybe it's a little wide or narrow in one area, and keep working on it until you adding pieces or taking bits away till you get it to fit just right. And here at the back of the heel, I did the whip stitch up and then back down again so it makes a cross stitch. And then I stitched this tab in place using the stitch marks that we made earlier. Finally, I'm getting around to cutting into leather and making the actual moccasin. I keep saying leather, but of course this can be felted wool coats or heavy fabric. But in this case, I'm making a leather moccasin. There's two ways that I can cut this out. Either use a rotary cutter. Of course, I would have to have it on a surface underneath the leather that wouldn't dull the blade. So I won't demonstrate it here. Or, of course, you can draw around it and cut it out with scissors. And then there's the stitch marks. And so these have been punched out, and I like to use a little micron pen to mark all those locations for the stitches. But any fine point marker would work well, or whatever you have. So I'll be cutting this out, punching out all the holes, and then before long, ready for stitching. Now I'm making the pattern for the bottom sole. So I want these moccasins to last longer, so I'm putting an inner tube sole here. To make the pattern, I take this sole pattern and draw around it, and then with the compass add 3/8 of an inch, or just by measuring 3/8 inch around. I want the stitches not to be on, this would be on the ground, so I want them raised up a little bit, so I'm raising them up 3/8 inches, and I pretty much use that for all sizes, but you can add more if you like for bigger sizes. And in fact, the easiest way to do this is to make a sole that's the same size as this underfoot part. It has to be, I don't think there's a tires that are quite wide enough to do that, but you can use natural rubber or whatever flexible material you think of. So I used this pattern to cut this piece out, and then I also drew around it here so I would know where to place it. I've cut out the bottom sole and drew a line of where it will be placed, and now I will cement it with contact cement. Contact cement works if you apply it on both surfaces that are going to be adhered. So I need to apply it on here and then here, and then wait until it dries, which might take 10 minutes or so, depending upon the weather and your material. So I've put this non-toxic cement, which is Aqualim 315 from Springfield Leather, and I put it in the best quality condiment bottle that I can find, because I have used a cheaper one, and the lid blew off one time when I was putting the cement on. So you can imagine what a mess that was. So I'll use this little brush. It's called an acid brush, that very inexpensive, but you can still wash them and reuse them. So I'll spread this. Don't have to go all the way to the line. The cement has dried on both of these surfaces, so I'm going to very carefully line this up. Okay. I'll show you how to make the 2-needle running stitch. I'm going to use a piece of light-colored waxed braided thread just so you can see what I'm doing, and then I'll take it out and stitch the area with black thread. It's handy to know about how to keep this thread on your needle. You can pierce the thread with the needle, then pull it through and kind of click it in place, and it's going to stay on there. So I'll start in this hole. And I'll take a needle down through the next hole. And then I'll go up through that same hole, holding this thread that's already in the hole over to the side. That's very important, because if you pierce the thread, then you're going to have a hard time making the next stitch. And also I need to, before I go too far, to straighten out, equalize the lengths of these two threads. So I'll continue like that, one thread down, the other one up, while you're holding the one that's already in the hole over to the side. And then giving a good tug each time on both threads. I've stitched the inner tube sewing on, and am ready to stitch the moccasin together. And you notice that I've cut out this T shape for the top line for making a fringed moccasin. So I'm starting to stitch in this corner. I've got a thread that's about 3 times the length of the area I'm stitching, and I'm back to the whip stitch. So I made a knot on the inside here. I don't think it could be felt. If you're concerned about that, you can pound the knot a bit so it doesn't stick up at all. And so just in and out. With Millie's moccasin, she wants all these 2 flaps, these edges, to be turned down. So cutting that T, we have a flap here that we're going to fold down and put fringe under, and a flap here, but we need to add one here. So I've just punched the holes, and we'll be stitching that and then ready to add the fringe. I've stitched this extra piece here, so I'll be folding it down with fringe coming out from under it, like I will these other two sides. I started my whip stitching from the center just so I could deal with this knot in the center instead of trying to deal with it at the side. So I went up here and then came back to finish the X's, and then this way and back, and tied my knot. And you would use the same technique for any kind of flap that you want to add in this direction. So I have this sample of a shoe that's more like a moccasin. It's not a side seam, it has seam all around it. And this tongue has been stitched on, so you can have any, of course, any shape that you want, anything that you want to add. Here I've added some bead work, so that could be one way that you deal with this top line, is to add something here. You could even, cut these edges off. Lots of options. Here's my granddaughter's moccasin coming along. I've cut out the fringe. I used some double-sided tape to hold it in place while I folded the top line over on both sides. And I have a 3-prong thonging chisel, it's called. So it makes slits, and I like that better than seeing round holes, but you can certainly use round holes and they will work just fine. So I've stitched this piece on the front so that I can have fringe there as well. I wanted to show you this 3-prong thonging chisel. This is from Osborne. I would say the only type to get is one that's all one piece of metal. Anything that's has 2 pieces, the prongs are going to start bending. And it's 1/8 of an inch between each of these prongs, so it gets constant use from me on any kind of stitching for the upper part of the shoe especially. I've used the thonging chisel to make slits all along here, so I'm doing that 2-needle running stitch down through the hole and then through the same slit, I'm holding this thread over to the side so that I don't split it, because that's going to get you stuck and in a mess. So, I gave it a good tug after I did that stitch. Before I stitch the back of the heel, I need to put this cord through that will hold the moccasin tight around the top line. So I just took one of my needles and put a thread on it, made a little hole in the end of this, and just thread it through. And then I'll tie it here at the front. So now that I have the toe and side stitched, I'm stitching the back of the heel, and I'm starting at the base like I did on the mock-up, and I put a knot at the end of the thread and left some thread beyond that knot so I can tie the 2 ends together when I get back here. So I'm going to whip stitch up and whip stitch back, just like I mentioned when you're making the mock-up. So I'll continue whip stitching to the top then turn around. And give my stitches a tug each time. I've just about finished the heel seam. So you can see the X's that formed, and so I'm taking this one last stitch and then I'm going to turn this inside out and stitch or tie these two ends together. And then I'll be stitching the rectangular flap at the base. And winding these, or weaving these threads under a few stitches. I'm stitching this rectangle at the base of the heel seam. I've made a knot on the inside and then stitched with just a simple running stitch, and now I'm filling in the empty spaces, and when I get back to there I will make a knot on the inside, and as usual bring the threads under a few stitches and clip them off. Here I have a variety of mock-ups and shoes that show you some of the possibilities with the side seam pattern. One is, this is from the standard side seam pattern, and so I've added a strap and a more unique kind of tab at the back of the heel. One of the things that you can do is to add a tab or a tongue here by stitching it on, and you can also turn this down so that the design or color on the back side can show. Here's an example of that on another shoe that's made with this T opening. Here's another one. This of course is not assembled. I look forward to assembling it because I would love to be wearing these. But this is made with the T, and so I've stitched on this tongue and kept these side pieces upright, and then tying it off with a piece of inner tube. This shoe shows a top line that comes to a point, which is really my favorite, and in this version I added a different color piece. All of this is just experimentation, but it might be useful. This shoe was a pointed top line shoe, but I cut the sides off, filled in that little space, and then added a tie around the top by punching holes all along the edge and just knotting them off there. Why not? Here you can see inside this shoe where some of the bagginess has been cut out by taking out a bit and restitching it. Here's a sweet little mock-up. I'm almost imagining having a tab across with Velcro fastening so that it's easy to get the little foot in there. Here are the final two moccasins that I'm going to show you in this video. The pink one is a mock that has no gathering around the toe. And how did I do that? Well, I added the same amount of side space for the above the foot part and the below the foot part. So since this is a children's shoe, I added a half an inch to each. And I'll be doing a video just on making that kind of a moccasin. And the other one is a canvas moccasin made from a pair of jeans that were not really sturdy but had too many holes for the wearer. So this turned out to look great, I thought. If you want to make your own surfer shoes, I'll be making a video of how to make these as well.